It's Peggy. Good to see everyone. I pray that you'll be able to listen to this chapter. It's really good. I peeked at it. Well, it's a beautiful day here. It may be the last of the nice warm days here in Washington, but I'm still hoping and praying for more. I just love the summer. I love just the warmth and love to be puttering around in the garden. Of course, I always talk about that, don't I? Well, I did read ahead a little bit on chapter 3 out in my yard the other day. I was sitting in my Chase lounge in the sun. It was so nice. And I started crying and crying. It was so funny. But there were no neighbors around, so that was good. Well, and let's today, of course, keep Israel in prayer. You know, as we treat Israel and as every country treats Israel, so goes their blessing also. So we bless Israel today, and we do pray for peace, and we speak shalom to Israel and to Jerusalem. Yes, shalom means nothing missing, nothing broken. So we speak that from heaven. It's a declaration because we know that's God's will, peace. And so we, as his ecclesia, can speak that forth into the atmosphere because it's him in us speaking forth that his peace would manifest and settle on Israel. Well, this week, like I was saying, chapter 3, let me turn to it here. The name of the chapter is Gloomy and Spiteful. And you remember last week in chapter 2, it was about Mrs. Dismal Forebodings, right? Very unhappy person, been hurt, of course, it looks like. I'm going to clean my glasses. She was obviously hurt in her past and couldn't forgive, couldn't move past it, just kept stewing on the things that had been done to her. And she became what she kept thinking about, spiteful and dismal and not thinking anything good for the day or for the future. So that was Much Afraid, now Grace and Glory. That was her aunt. My glasses are crooked. That was her aunt. And the aunt had two daughters who were Grace and Glory's cousins. And they got married, evidently, and had very bad things happen to them also. And so then they became the names that the allegory gives them. One was gloomy and one was spiteful. So can you imagine that family? Dismal forebodings gave birth to gloomy and spiteful. So if we are gloomy, if let's say we're dismal and foreboding and resentful and all that, if we continue being that way and continue the thoughts from our heart and mind, we're going to give birth, in other words, to gloomy and spiteful too. It's like a tree, it branches and branches and branches. So today we're going to learn about gloomy and spiteful. Okay. Bitterness and his wife murmuring were the proprietors of the village inn at much trembling. It was a picturesque, many-gabled building standing among shady trees on a corner of the village green. On one side of the inn was a bowling lawn, and on the other side was a pleasant tea garden lying along the bank of the river, where there were boats for hire. Sounds like a nice place, doesn't it? The bar room was clean, freshly painted, and comfortable, an attractive meeting place for all the village cronies. Farmers from all over the valley gathered at the Much Trembling Inn on market days, and Bitterness and his wife not only had a very prosperous business, but they prided themselves on running it very respectable indeed as a comfortable, up-to-date hotel patronized by all the best people, including old Lord Fearing himself, who often gathered there with his friends in a private parlor. So here we're hearing words already of being respectable, pride, things like that. So timid Sulking, who was nicknamed Moody, a younger brother of Mrs. Murmuring, also lived at the inn and helped in the work. He had married Mrs. Dismal Foreboding's daughter, Spiteful, but the marriage had turned out most unhappily, for Moody had the reputation of possessing the quickest and most uncertain temper in the village. And his wife, poor girl, had the sharpest tongue. So look at that marriage. We've got somebody that's got the quickest temper, uncertain temper, married to the girl with the sharpest tongue. Now that's a recipe for distress. Wow. So keep in mind these things, our attitudes. Only a short time before Grace and Glory returned to the valley, Moody had been sentenced to a term in prison for almost beating his young wife to death while he was under the influence of drink. And this just at a time when the whole village was already gossiping about Sir Coward Fearing's desperation of his wife, Gloomy, who was Spiteful's sister. So that's a sad story. When Spiteful was first married, the Honorable Mrs. Coward Fearing had not often condescended to visit Spiteful at the village inn, but since the tragedy of her husband's desertion, a common bond of misery and sorrow seemed to have drawn her to her sister and had worked a great change in the haughty Gloomy. So Gloomy and Spiteful are sisters, right? They both married badly, had bad things happen. And Gloomy, who was kind of haughty, the things that she went through took her down a few pegs, and she began to change. Every day since her sister's illness, so Spiteful, see, she was in the attic of her little apartment, up in the attic, hiding because she had wounds all over her body from the beating that she had from her husband. And you see, the whole family was so full of pride that they didn't want her to be seen. They didn't want the precious boy to be looked at unfavorably. So the sister is pretty much living alone, hidden in an attic now. Every day since her sister's illness, she had gone furtively and as secretly as possible to the attic to do what she could for her help and comfort. Outwardly, perhaps, that was not very much, for Gloomy had always despised housework and knew very little indeed about cleaning a room, cooking, or nursing someone back to health. She had little spoken comfort to give either. She did everything in a silent, dreary way, even gloomier than her name. But even so, her daily visits were the one bright spot, if such it could be called, in her sister's miserable existence. The feeling that one person, at least in the world, cared to be with her was like an anchor to the soul of the poor, forlorn girl. Mrs. Dismal Forebodings herself was so overcome by the humiliations and disgrace which had befallen the family that she could not be persuaded to leave her own cottage and meet the curious or pitying stares of the neighbors, though she did prepare and send along little bits of meals, soups or broth or eggs or whatever she could spare. Gloomy certainly had no more desire than her mother to face the stares of the neighbors, but nevertheless, day by day, at a time when the streets were most deserted, she made her way to the attic, where she then spent most of the day with her sister. It seemed almost as though she found some slight solace for her own misery in trying to help the even deeper misery of her sister. Wow. Let's see what questions I had. What caused Gloomy and Spiteful to begin spending time together? What I just read? Well, they had a common bond of misery. And what was their, well, they haven't seen Grace and Glory yet, so I won't ask you that. But yeah, they say, misery loves company, right? Well, I guess it does. It did in this situation. They never spoke much together, but sometimes when poor Spiteful, overcome by weakness and exhaustion, broke into anguished tears, Gloomy would sit beside her, awkwardly holding her hand. None of the Dismal Forebodings knew how to express sympathy or affection. You see, all these other attitudes of dreary, attitudes, they kind of pushed out any good feelings or attitudes, right? And so they didn't know how to sympathize with anyone. It was the best that she could do, and more than Gloomy herself ever realized. She did lighten and ease her sister's sorrow, even that little thing that she was doing for her. On this particular morning, after washing up the 2 cracked plates and cups and saucers, Gloomy swept the floor, dusted the few bits of furniture, and then, taking her work bag, she sat down by the side of her sister and began silently to help with the sewing. A huge basket of mending stood on the floor between them. Mrs. Bitterness was determined that Spiteful should help as much as possible, even during her convalescence. And as she could no longer spend long hours in the kitchen washing dishes, her work was now to do all the mending for the hotel. For some time, the 2 sisters worked in silence. And then there came a light tap on the door. They looked at one another, startled and puzzled. Who could it be? Spiteful had shrunk pitifully from receiving visits from the neighbors, and murmuring had also discouraged them strongly. The sooner the miserable affair was hushed up and forgotten, the better. And if Spiteful kept out of sight and didn't talk, the more quickly people would forget. The knock on the door was repeated, and then, as no one in the room answered, the caller apparently decided upon entering without permission, for the door opened, and Grace and Glory stepped into the room. followed by her two beautiful companions, Joy and Peace. At the sight of her cousin, Spiteful sank back in her seat and covered her face with her hands, as though to try to hide herself. Gloomy sat rigid and silent at her side, only making one slight involuntary movement, as though to interpose her own form between that of the newcomer and her sister. Grace and Glory stepped forward and looked beseechingly at her cousins, and then kneeling down beside Spiteful, put her arms around the shrinking figure and said softly, with the tears running down her cheeks, "Oh, Spiteful, please, please do not turn from me. Do let me be with you for just a little while. You don't know how often my heart has ached for you since I got back to the valley a few days ago and heard of your sorrow. And oh, I am so glad to find that Gloomy is here too. I have not seen either of you for such a long time. Do tell me that you are just a little pleased to see me and will let me stay." Neither sister spoke a word, but Spiteful suddenly burst into tears and laid her head on the shoulder of her kneeling cousin, as though at last all the bitter anguish of her broken heart must find an outlet. Isn't that precious? Wow. So what was their response when they saw Grace and Glory come into the room? Well, they were ashamed, embarrassed, right? They weren't happy. They wanted to hide. But how did Grace and Glory begin to minister to her sister? Well, she knelt down beside her, right? Put her arms around her. She was crying. She cared. She was showing her love for her cousin. And when no one else had even done so. So she wanted to hug her and comfort her. For some time they continued like this, without a word being spoken, until finally the wild sobbings ceased, and Grace and Glory, taking her handkerchief, wiped the tear-stained face and kissed her cousin again and again. I think this is where I start crying. Then there came a little interruption. The two tall strangers, who all this while had remained unnoticed in the background, now came forward, saying sweetly, "Please come and refresh yourselves. We have made everything ready." Gloomy and Spiteful looked up in amazement, and then again shrank back as though in shame or embarrassment. The ugly, unpainted little table was now covered with a cloth. On it stood a vase in which were arranged some of the sweetest perfumed flowers that the sisters had ever seen, pure white with a golden crown at the heart of each one. Beside, and that's a picture too, their visitors, Grace and Glory and Joy and Peace, isn't it? They are like those pure white flowers with golden crowns in their hearts. Beside the vase of flowers were plates filled with wild strawberries and blueberries and pomegranates, and there was a loaf of bread, a pat of butter, and a comb of fresh honey. Delicacies which never before had appeared in that dreary attic, or in Mrs. Dismal's almost equally dreary cottage. It was enough to tempt the weakest appetite. Peace was over by the stove, pouring boiling water into the teapot, and Joy was holding a bottle of fresh milk in one hand and a little jug of cream in the other. Spiteful looked at her sister speechlessly, and Gloomy said in a voice which tried to be a little like the old haughty one, "We cannot accept charity like this. Much, much, much." And then she broke off, as though she couldn't finish the name, and added almost tremblingly, "As though we were beggars, Grace and Glory." Which is what they really are, though. Which is what we really are, though, added Spiteful. "This isn't charity," said Grace and Glory with a little laugh. "We picked these strawberries and blueberries up on the high places this morning before coming down to the valley, and the other fruits are out of the king's gardens, and the honey is from his hives. My dearest cousins, nobody thinks he is accepting charity when a king gives." The sisters looked at one another, and then Spiteful, who through all her illness and weakness had seen nothing whatever to tempt her appetite, looked longingly at the fresh fruits on the daintily spread table, and Gloomy saw the look. She got up, and taking her sister's hand, said simply, "Thank you very much." Spiteful has been so weak and sick, it really would be the most absurd pride on our part to refuse. And as she says, no one has less right to be proud than we have. See, their haughtiness, their pride has now been cut down because of their situation. And then grace and glory and joy and peace, of course, which stands for the Lord, us, with him in us, that came into the room and changed the atmosphere. So how did Grace and Glory and her companions minister to the sisters? Well, they hugged them, were glad to see them. They held them when they cried, and they fed them, right? So simple things of comfort. What were the sisters' responses? Well, they were, again, embarrassed, timid. Is there a time when you've met another's need who was not expecting it or wanting help? How did it turn out? One thing is we have to put our own pride, have to get it out. You know, my camera is not doing well today. I gotta not move very much. So let's continue here. The sisters looked at one another, and then Spiteful, who through all her illness had, she looked at the food, at the fresh fruits, at the daintily spread table, and Gloomy saw the look, and she said, "Thank you." So no one was prideful anymore. Then all three sat down at the table, and joy and peace waited on them in the deftest and kindest manner possible. First, they cut the bread into enticingly thin slices. Then they served the strawberries and cream. And while those were being eaten, Joy prepared the pomegranates and apples, and Peace whipped up a nourishing and delicious concoction of eggs. As they ate the meal up there in the cheerless attic, Spiteful felt almost like a queen being coaxed with delicacies. A faint color stole into her cheeks, and a little light appeared in her eyes. While they were eating, Grace and Glory described to them the places up on the mountains where the strawberries grew, and the banks covered with blueberries, the pine woods with the lovely spicy smell of sun-warmed cones, the humming of the bees over the fields of flowers, and even a little bit about the king's garden and the pomegranate trees in whose shade they had eaten their breakfast that very morning. She told them of the king's love for the pomegranates and the belief of the eastern peoples on the other side of the mountains that no evil spirit can approach a pomegranate tree because it is the tree of love. So here they're bringing fruit, pomegranates, that they knew were the tree of love. Then, little by little, Gloomy and Spiteful began to speak too, hesitatingly at first, asking questions. Gloomy wanted to know what the white golden-hearted flowers were in the center of the table, which gave forth the lovely perfume. She had never seen such flowers before. Grace and Glory blushed a little as she answered that they were the flowers of love, which grow up in the high places. But she did not add that she had picked those particular blooms from the tree which the shepherd had planted in her own heart. See, she's giving of her own heart. Then they wanted to know about her journey. But Grace and Glory did not seem able to say much about that, only to speak of the shepherd's goodness and help, and over again speak of the shepherd himself. By the time the delicious little picnic meal was ended, the three cousins were talking together with an ease and friendliness which they had never felt before. Stranger still, as Joy and Peace gathered up the remains of the repast and insisted on doing the washing up away in the background, something happened to Gloomy and Spiteful. They began haltingly and in low voices, often breaking off as though unable to continue, to speak about their own sorrows to Grace and Glory. Somehow, even the names of Coward Fearing, Moody, and Craven Fear passed their lips. Poor Spiteful, even murmuring excuses for her husband, who had beaten her. It was noticeable that never once did she utter a word of blame. That's big. And Gloomy, with a dark, painful flush on her cheeks, muttered something about her own cold, haughty attitude and her unfitness for marriage, unable as she was to win and keep her husband's love. So see, they're taking ownership of some things that maybe they had a part in. It maybe was not all one-sided, that their husbands left and beat them. Then Grace and Glory, also hesitatingly, told them of her own experience, of the plant in her heart, which she had supposed to be love, only to find that it was selfish, possessive love, and the longing to be loved, and of all the anguish it had caused her, until away up there on the mountains, it had been wrenched out of her heart for altogether. She told them also of her two companions, Sorrow and Suffering, and how up on the high places they had actually been transformed into joy and peace. And the two handmaidens, hearing their names mentioned, looked round, and smiled radiantly. Isn't that precious? So as the cousins were eating together, what did Grace and Glory emphasize about all she'd learned? Well, they wanted to hear about all the places and things she saw. She wanted to talk about the shepherd, right? So Grace and Glory had a humble description of herself when she was talking to them about how she was before going to the high places. And she was thinking of herself at the time and her need for love. This was before she went up to the high places with the shepherd. But the love she had was a selfish love, a longing to be loved, like we read in Hind's Feet. And that was not agape love, unconditional love that is self-giving. But that is what Grace and Glory is showing, is bringing forth in this chapter to her cousins. Agape love, unconditional love. Doesn't matter what they did, right? So, yes, what did she mean by longing to be loved? Well, like I said, it's selfish, but I think every human being has a longing to be loved. And it's not that that's a wrong thing. It's just, it's partial and it's pointed toward yourself, where real love is much bigger. Agape love is, and it's pointed outward. Of course, we love ourselves also as He loves us, but it's pointed outward. And that's where it gets its satisfaction. As she spoke, it seemed that in some miraculous way, the stuffy, miserable attic had expanded and changed, and they were sitting out on the mountainside, and the fir trees roofing them overhead, the fresh mountain air blowing around them, and the snowy peaks shining above, and the voice of the great waterfall sounding in their ears as it leaped down singing to the valleys below. See, even the atmosphere had been transformed. Then Grace and Glory sang to them another of the songs which she had learned on the mountains of pomegranates. O holy love, O burning flame, why should I longer roam? Forth from the heart of God I came, and yearn back to my home. Send forth thy truth, O shining light, that I may follow till I come at last before the night, up to thy holy hill. For there my soul longs to abide, within the holy place, and when the veil is drawn aside, to see my Father's face. O thou from whom my spirit came, and wanders in this wild, behold, I bear thy lovely name. Lead home thy wandering child. So she sang that song to her cousins. Wow. As she finished singing, there came another knock on the door. Low, but quite clear. Gloomy and Spiteful again started and looked at one another questioningly, and then at Grace and Glory. A lovely color had flooded into her cheeks now, and her eyes shone like stars. Here I go again. Well, that's one big thing that has changed in me, right? I've got a very, very soft heart. I have to read this, though. I have to be able to read. Isn't the Lord good? And each of us has a story. We're all epistles. And we could all have a story like this written about our lives, couldn't we? She knew in an instant whose hand it was that knocked on the door of that dismal attic. As her two cousins stared at her speechlessly, the knock came again, a little louder, a little more insistent. And that's how the Lord, knocks on the door of our hearts. He wants to come in, and he wants to plant that tree of love in our hearts too. Thank you that he has, right? Oh, entreated Grace and Glory, oh, spiteful and gloomy. It is he whom we have been talking about. It is the shepherd himself. Open the door and tell him to come in. You see, that's not her job. That's their job. They have to decide whether to open the door of their attic, of their hearts, and let him in. Every drop of blood seemed to drain away from Spiteful's already pallid cheeks. She shrank back, casting a stricken look around the wretched room and at her own ragged clothes, which scarcely covered the bruises on her body. She cringed backwards, covering her face with her hands. For a minute there was dead silence. So complete it seemed as though the beating of every heart in the room must become audible. Then through the silence there came a third knock, and a man's strong, gentle, patient voice was heard saying, "May I come in?" Gloomy rose to her feet. She was trembling from head to foot, but she touched her sister's arm and pointed wordlessly and entreatingly towards the door. Then poor Spiteful, the sorrowful, destitute owner of the miserable attic, stumbled across the room and opened the door. The shepherd stepped inside, tall, powerful, with regal mane, and yet with a look of infinite compassion on his face. Spiteful looked at him just once, and then cast herself full length on the ground at his feet with a bitter cry of anguish. So sweet, isn't it? Oh, I can't read yet. My eyes are full of tears. She fell full length on the ground at his feet with a bitter cry of anguish, saying, "Lord, have pity on me." He put out his hand to lift her up, but before he could do so or speak a word, there was Gloomy, the one-time haughty daughter-in-law of old Lord Fearing, kneeling at his feet beside her sister, whispering through trembling lips, "Have mercy on me also, Lord. Don't leave me outside thy grace." As he raised them both together with words of love and compassion. The look on the shepherd's face was that of one who at last had achieved his heart's desire, of the Savior who knows that now he may begin the heavenly work of saving. Grace and Glory, with joy and peace, standing beside her, looked on and said in her heart, "No, not even up on the high places have we known such joy as this. This attic is none other than the house of God." Oh boy.
This attic is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. That's from Genesis 28:17. Wow. I'm just a puddle of tears today. And you see, my pride had to go when I started doing these 3 clocks on Saturday. Lord said, be vulnerable. I didn't know how vulnerable that was going to be, though, did I? But it's good. Oh. So what happened to Gloomy and Spiteful at the end of the picnic? Well, they came to the shepherd and asked for his mercy, didn't they? Isn't that something? Because Grace and Glory had been telling them all the things about the shepherd, all the things that their hearts, their true hearts really longed for and needed and wanted. Everybody wants that agape love from the Father. How did the 2 sisters first respond to the shepherd's knock? Well, they were afraid of him, weren't they? And, what did they expect to see on his face? Well, it's hard to know, maybe like maybe he wouldn't accept them, right? They almost were fainted with fear. They couldn't speak and couldn't think. And they didn't think that he would be happy with them. He didn't think that he would accept them. They expected to see disgust, probably, or condemnation. But what his response, though, was love, compassion, kindness, and open arms, wasn't it? Can you just imagine those 2 horrible sisters, just so beaten down by life and their own reactions, just casting themselves at his feet? I mean, my goodness. And then him lifting them up. So sweet. Well, I guess I better go. That's the end of the chapter. And I won't say forgive me for crying. So again, keep Israel in your hearts and your prayers today. I'm going to peek and see what next week is going to be. Chapter 4. Hope it's going to be a happier one. I mean, this was about the happiest you could get, isn't it? But it's okay. Mountain of Camphor. So it's going to be about joy, the victory of love. So that's going to be a good chapter. Well, if any of you have it on your heart to give, I'll put all the ways that you can give in the comments. There's PayPal and Venmo and Zelle and Cash App, you name it. I would be very thankful. But I'm thankful for any of you that watch this, and I bless you and love you, and I'll see you next week. Okay? Bye-bye.